What's up, gangsters? How about what might be the rarest thing on the interwebs these days? A completed project video from right here at the headquarters of Rube Goldberg Enterprises. Yeah, I finally, after about, 8-9 months, finished the Ming 1/48 scale FA-18E. Yes, this thing right here. It's been quite the adventure, and honestly is the main reason why I have not been doing much in the way of videos of any kind. I've just been so singularly focused on this thing, and I've been putting a lot of my energy into the Sprue Cutters Union podcast and just life in general. And so, yeah, videos of any kind are rare, but yes, especially finished project videos. And if you've kept up with any of my nonsense, you know that with this particular kit, turned out to be a bit more of a project than I anticipated at the beginning. I literally thought this dumb thing was going to take me 3 months, and it was going to just be like a month of super fun painting. Yes, famous last words. Anyway, this is part 2 of my normal 2-part sort of build review thing that I do, and part 1 has been on the channel for a while. It's an exhaustive and exhausting 1-hour trip through the minutia of building this kit. The sort of summary is that this is, I've said this so many times now, I'm so tired of talking about this thing. This thing is kind of what I call an 80% kit. It's not a bad kit, but it's not a great kit. And for me, where it falls short of being great is that while the engineering is pretty solid, really good in some cases, the details are nice, not, like 1,000-part detail like you might get with some kits, but good enough. The decals are really good, the instructions are really good. It's overall a nice kit, and if you just want to build it right out of the box and not fuss with it, it's going to satisfy you. But if you're really picky about the way things fit together, it is going to tax you, or at least if you are, have a ridiculous level of obsessiveness over stuff like that, like I do, that 20% is going to tax you. And I went through all that in my first video. But there are a few things that I did not get to with that one that I want to cover here in part 2. And so I'll do that. But before I get into all that nonsense, let's just take a look at what I actually managed to accomplish with this project.
All I want
Okay, so here we go to get into it and kind of pick back up where the first video on this thing left off with a couple of things. One of the one of the major issues that I had that ended up causing me a bunch of trouble was right here with the canopy. I showed you guys how I attempted to widen the canopy gradually with a little bit of warmth and a spreader, and so here is the result of that. This is that canopy, and as you can see, when I took all of the masking material off of it, stress fracture right there. Yep. And I knew that was a possibility, but I chose to gamble on it, and I lost. Yes, I lost. And it cost me $18 for a new replacement canopy that I was lucky enough to get based on one of the SMCG guys sending me an eBay link. And there's a dude in Georgia who was parting out the sprues. And so I got all the clear sprues within a couple of days, and I started the process of making the front of it wide enough because it also was it was not as bad. It was about a 0.5 millimeter too narrow right here at the interface between the canopy and the windscreen. And so the second go around, I thought, well, all right, not going to do the gradual heat, but I'm going to do gentle heat. I'm going to just use some boiling water. So I put a spreader in there, put some boiling water, and just threw the whole thing in boiling water, took it out, let it cool off, put it on, and sure enough, the width was exactly what I needed it to be. Maybe just a skosh narrow. You can see right here, it's pretty damn close. Much better than it was. You can see there's still a little bit of lip showing right there, but that's like 25% of what it was. Where I did screw up though was I should have put a spreader also further back, because you can see that it ended up kind of curving right there along the edge of the canopy frame. But not too bad, and those two things were by far the least of the issues, because here's the crazy thing that happened. Apparently, throwing a canopy into boiling hot water is a lot like throwing a brand new pair of jeans in boiling hot water, because the whole damn thing shrank. Like, it literally shrank in length a 0.5 millimeter. And you could stick a credit card through the gap between the two clear parts. So that caused me to have to do a whole bunch of reshaping. I had to build material up on the front edge, front face of the canopy, reshape all of it to get it correct, and it was just a giant ass whipping. And you can see, it's not technically correct anymore, because when you compare the width of the canopy frame between the original one and the new one, mine is now just a little bit too wide, but it's better than having a giant gap there. And again, this is something that people have seen varying degrees of. I saw somebody post a finished build of this on the Ming page, and they had the canopy closed, and there was that 20 thousandths 0.5 millimeter gap between the two clear parts was there. So it's an issue, but how bad it is, just depends on your copy of the kit. So anyway, got that dealt with, and I'm pretty happy with it. There was a lot of polishing and sanding and filing, but just fundamental construction stuff that, while not fun, at least is relatively controllable and straightforward. Enough of that. The other thing that I mentioned in part one was the exhaust nozzles and how soft the detail was with those. And you can see, just really soft, just not great. Concessions to injection molding being what they are, it's not too surprising, but I chose to create my own design in Fusion 360 and print them on my Epax X14K resin printer. And I've got a couple of the iterations here. I tried to really preserve the thinness of the turkey feathers, whatever leaves, whatever you want to call them. I also wanted to get those screw covers that are on the insides of these things. You can see those round circles inside there. And it took me about 3 tries. I had, some challenges with the way that resin shrinks that I don't really want to bore you with here. But overall, a pretty good result that I'm pretty happy with. Had to do a bit of sanding, priming, but this is the result. And I feel like it's definitely better than the original part. And you can see that I was able to get the screw covers inside there, and I did those as just little recesses so that they would hold some ink and make them relatively easy to paint, because I had to reach inside there with a brush, obviously, and do that. So I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. Another little glitch that I ran into is, even though the way that the horizontal stabilizers plug in to the poly caps that go into the fuselage is pretty straightforward, the holes in the fuselage were a bit small. And so I had to ream those out before the shaft on the edge of the stabilizer would go in. And that was a bit annoying. Speaking of things being a little bit the wrong diameter, I should note also that the diameter of the holes in the fuselage back here for the jet engine inserts was too small. They wouldn't go in. What I did is I used the kit parts for everything that's inside, and these nozzles are the only part that I produced. And so the kit parts really should have just slid right in there, and they just didn't. I had to do a lot of filing to open up the diameters in here for those to go in the way that they should. That's just, that was just an annoyance. Could have been better for sure. Another thing, and this is a little bit debatable, is these little fin tennas. There's 3 of them, and if you look, there's it's a base. It's got a base on the bottom of it that plugs into a little sort of octagonal, hexagonal recess. Well, they fit the recess fine, but the bases are really thick, and so you have this huge step that sticks up. Now, depending on your reference photos, some of them have a little bit of a base. There's actually even an SMCG guy who works on Hornets who measured it on his aircraft, and he found that base is 5/8 of an inch thick. But the way that Ming has designed it, it's more like 2 inches thick, and it just looked goofy. So, I just trimmed it off so that they sit flush, and I think that's better. If I'd looked if I had seen the photos that the Hornet mechanic showed me sooner, I just wouldn't have trimmed off quite as much. But they were like 2 millimeters thick, and I ended up trimming about 1.5 millimeters of that away so that it would be flush. Another thing here that I ran into very late in the game, and this was a bad deal, is, and I knew this all along, but I just sort of was in denial and I was ignoring it, is that my ailerons were not symmetrical. This everything on this side was really straight, but over here on this side, this one was drooping and twisting at the outside corner. And the more I actually didn't see it, and I saw it, I knew it was there, but I thought it wasn't going to be really noticeable until I started working through all of the photography, and I was like, oh yeah, that's really noticeable, that's not going to work. And so what I ended up doing was popping this missile rail off, which needed to be done anyway, because I'll tell you about it in a second. Popping that off, which was no big deal, and then putting some extra thin in the joint here and loosening the outer half of the joint where this aileron attaches to the wing, and then using some some rubber bands and doing some clamping and putting some more boiling hot water on it. And I managed to do a pretty good job of straightening all this. It's to the point where it's really hard to see without measuring tools, so I'm okay with that. But here's the real point to this is that this is not one of those things where, as some idiot said, if this thing isn't straight when you put it together, it's your own fault. Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of whether or not you see it and choose to fix it. But the thing with this kit is that the engineering is really pretty good. But if you depend on the engineering to make everything come out correctly, you may have some disappointment because of the way things fit and because not everything is going to come out of the injection mold perfectly. And in particular, the way this kit's designed, the entire top of the fuselage here is one giant piece. And that's a large area, thin piece for injection molding. And, warpage can totally happen. And I think that what happened is that this out here is not quite planar with everything else. And so that contributed to a couple of things. One is that even though this wingtip plugs in very solidly and in a very straightforward fashion, there's a tab on the end of it that plugs into a slot type thing, or maybe it's a little insert that goes in there. I can't remember. Let's get the instructions out of the trash and take a quick look at how all of that happens, because it's been a minute since I did it. Okay, this is really pretty good engineering, and it's the kind of thing that will lead you to believe that it's all going to turn out fine. See right there at the tip of the wing, when you sandwich those two halves together, you put that tab in there, depending on whether you're going to have the wing tips up or down. So you've got that tab sticking out, and then when you add the wing tips down here at step 11, you're basically sandwiching the two halves of the wingtip around that tab. So you're led to believe pretty easily that everything is going to come out fine. And so you compare all of it to the other side. As long as it's all symmetrical, you're pretty good. And for the most part, it does come out that way. But this wingtip is just slightly lower than the other one. Again, hopefully below the visual threshold. But that affects the aileron. But this aileron was also clearly bent and twisted so that the outside of it was low and the back corner of it was even lower. It was twisted down. And so I had to straighten that. All of that combined to having this missile rail pointing at an obnoxious angle towards the sky, which was obviously not good. So in fixing this aileron issue, I also mostly took care of this thing sitting level. It's all a lot better, but it's one of those things where, again, with measuring tools, I'm unhappy. With just my eyeballs, I'm okay with it. Just hope nobody else sees it or gets out the measuring tools. And since I'm taking this thing to the IPMS Nationals next week, yeah, I feel like maybe I shouldn't release this video until after the contest. Anyway, it is what it is. I did my best, and I'm pretty happy with the thing overall. So, with that, I'm going to take it off of the stand and flip it over, and we'll talk a little bit about the bottom of it. But while I'm doing that, I can say that this is a custom piece that I've designed and printed for my Masterpiece Models Benchmate so that I can transport this thing a little bit better. It has a nice cradle that it sits in. You can see that the back piece is also custom. So anyway, that's what's going on there. So there you go. That's what's going on with that. Nice foam padding. That should be a nice cushy ride for the Little Hornet for a 14-hour car ride. Hopefully. Those are not also famous last words. Okay, I always breathe a sigh of relief when I manage to flip one over on its back without breaking anything. My clumsy hands are just not confidence inspiring for that. Anyway, you can see how all of this turned out. It's honestly, this is my favorite view of this thing. This to me is where it's the most interesting. But just a couple of quick notes about the kit. Again, from the bottom perspective, this arrestor hook needed a little bit of fiddling to get it to fit in properly. Again, your mileage may vary on that. You can see again where the thing with these position lights that I was talking about happened, where I scribed those in and then painted them. I was really happy with the way that turned out. I think it's a nice detail. It's just that you don't get to see it very much. But these are the kit parts that I mentioned, and you can see that again, there is no reason for them not to have included those in the molding of that part. Would have been totally straightforward. I think they just honestly probably forgot or didn't know that they were there. It happens. Anyway, the only other thing really that I had not been able to talk about before was the fit of all the landing gear stuff. And that all went pretty good. But I will say that again, if you depend purely on the engineering for all of the main gear stuff to sit properly, it may not. There's enough slop in there and quite a bit of leverage, and you know, you could end up with a model that sits a little bit wonky if you're not paying attention. So just, you know, sort of builder beware on that. The other thing is the nose gear, that all went, you know, super good. It all fit great. Engineering very solid, no issue there. The engineering on the nose gear doors was, I mean, it's all pretty much the same, where it's got these little tabs that fit they're the hinges, and they are supposed to plug into little square holes inside here. You can kind of see right in there, and it's pretty solid engineering. It works pretty well, but it's not a guarantee that the doors are going to sit at the exact correct angle. They don't just fall in there correctly. You do have to pay attention to that. The other thing is, here's a mistake that I made. And again, this is a good time to pull out the instruction sheet where I just straight screwed up. Okay, so I looked at, let's see if I can find it here. Okay, so right here, if you look at this step, okay, look at part C24, okay, and you can see where it fits down there onto part C14. And C14 has a little stub sticking out of the back side of it, and there is a hole in part C24 that looks like that should fit onto that stub. Well, it's a natural thing to think, but the hole's a little too small. Well, I spent some time drilling it out because I thought that was just a hinge point. Well, it's not. The hinge point is actually underneath part C24, and that hole is just a lightning hole. It's actually a tube. If you look at reference photos of that part, it's actually a tube with a sort of bell crank sticking out of it. Anyway, the point is, I spent a bunch of time making the hole bigger, and then the linkage wasn't long enough to mate with the little bitty hole in the door that it's supposed to fit into. And so I chopped it off and lengthened it with a piece of brass tubing. It doesn't look terrible, but yeah, it's pretty embarrassing because if I had just seen the reference photos first, I would have understood and I would not have gone through all those gyrations. So totally a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Don't make the same mistake I did. Anyway, this is how we develop our craftsmanship skills, right? Anyway, the gear doors on the back end all went in pretty nicely, all pretty straightforward. The fit was good, but again, you just have to be careful to make sure that everything is sort of symmetric on both sides because it's easy for it not to be. You just have to be paying attention. Now, one thing that you may notice is not quite symmetric is that this center line tank is a little closer on one side to the other. That is maybe partly because of the gear doors, but more likely it's because of the tank itself. You can see it's a little bit off center. Yeah, well, that is because, again, I assumed that the pins that hold that thing to the pylon were straight. I never really eyeballed them. And it wasn't until I put the tank on that I realized that they were in fact not parallel and that it was kicking the tank over to one side a little bit. So I worked with it and I got it to where it was better. But you can see that there's play in that because the poly caps, they're soft. And so, again, it's not exact. Don't assume it's going to be exact because it may just, again, not be exactly quite right. And after all this stuff is painted and put together is the wrong time to discover it. Okay, so last thing on the bottom here that I want to cover, as you guys know, all right, I magnetized all of these pylons. One thing I want to really emphasize is make sure, be super careful as you're going through something like this to get the polarity of all your magnets to match up, because I fucked up and I had one that didn't match. And I don't know how it happened because I mocked it all up and I would have bet $1,000 it was all good. But when I went to put this pylon and its rack of GBU 53s in place, it was trying to bounce off into space because the magnets were repelling each other. And let me tell you something, digging a magnet out of a pylon like that so that you can flip it over is not fun. 0 out of 10, do not recommend. So yeah, just have to be super careful. Mark your magnets, mark your pylons, make sure that they're all going in correctly if you're going to do this magnetizing thing. The other thing that I would say with magnets is, sometimes not as strong as we would think. So I used 2mm round magnets that are 2mm long. And in mocking it up, I felt like they were strong enough. Now in retrospect, not so much, because even though these tanks are much bigger, they're super lightweight. They're fine. These parts are fine. Resin, it's denser, it weighs more, and the single 2mm by 2mm magnet, really not quite enough for these racks of weapons or these racks of my GBU 54s that I designed and printed as well over here on this side. Those things combined with the Res Kit BRU 57, and yes, it should be a BRU 55. I didn't know that until too late. Anyway, the weight of all that was a bit too much for this magnet, and it just wanted to sit with a little too much of a gap underneath the pylon. And so I ended up using some of my foiling adhesive because it's super sticky and temporary. If I ever needed to yank those off, I could. I put some of that under there to just make sure that they're solid, and again, that they're not going to come flying off on the 14-hour ride to Omaha. So anyway, that's all done, and I feel pretty good about it. That all, I think, looks good, and the whole exercise with the weapons was, a total ass whipping. But hey, I think that this is something that a lot of model makers don't spend a lot of time on, but it adds so much authenticity and realism. I just am really glad that I chose to do all of these stores first, because after all of the work on the airframe, if I had looked at this and thought, oh, I still got to do all of this hangy downy stuff, I probably would have thrown myself out a window and never finished. So yeah, that proved to be really good strategy on my part in terms of maintaining my momentum and motivation on what ended up being a really long and exhausting project. So the rest of it is really all about paint and weathering. And so let me just talk about that for a few minutes, and then we'll be done with this. Okay, so I'm not going to talk too much about the paint and weathering because, number one, I have covered all of this stuff in other videos. I've got a pretty lengthy video that's dedicated to oil paint rendering for aircraft. And so basically everything that I've done here is covered in that video. My Spitfire video covers, I think, a lot of the paint stuff. But anyway, just in quick summary, this is all as per usual, living that lacquer life with MRP. All of the markings, whether they be decals or painted on, are done directly on the paint, as always. And there is a combination of markings on here that I'll talk about as well. But I did not do, well, let me, before I say that, all of the flat coating is my favorite. Guns GX 113 for the base flat coat. That stuff is just super bulletproof. I love it so much. And I say base flat coat because there's plenty of places where once I've got the overall thing flattened, unglossed, that I do spot work. Like, for example, I put a layer of GX 113 on the whole thing before I start doing oil paint rendering, like building all of these streaks and stains back here. But then once that's done and I want to seal all this in, I'm not going to go shoot the whole thing with another layer of GX 113. I'm going to come back and just spot spray that. And I'll typically use the MRP Super Clear Matte for spot unglossing because it's so nice. You can use it straight out of the bottle, but I will also reduce it like 50% a lot. But this is great stuff. I love it. I don't think it's quite as hardy as GX 113, but GX 113 is just freakishly durable. It's amazing stuff. I love it. Did I already say that? I love it? Yeah, anyway, I do. I love it. Anyway, so this is all OPR, all oil paint rendering. But I did do a little bit of ink work. The wash that I used inside the wheelbase is Magic Wash that I made using Liquitex ink and Aqua Gloss and a little bit of Flow-Aid. And it works pretty good. I'm just sorry, I can't help but pick out pieces of Flerm that I see while I'm doing this. Anyway, it works pretty good. The effect here is maybe a little contrasty, but I should say that my overall goal with this project was for it to be a bit contrasty. I wanted to kind of turn up the contrast and saturation level on this project just a little bit higher than I've done in the past because I'm kind of still working on finding what I really love. But also I just felt like that with all these gray tones that they just really kind of needed that to pop a lot. And so that's kind of, why this is just a little bit Technicolor. Anyway, I think it's probably worth pointing out that on my not Mark 82s, they used to be a long time ago, but now GBU 54s. And if you don't know, the GBU 54 is the upgrade to the GBU 38, where now it's a laser guided bomb as opposed to being a GPS guided weapon. So that's the difference. And if you're not familiar with the GBU 53Bs, these are the latest generation of the small diameter bomb, which is probably going to be in pretty wide use in 10 years which is when this aircraft is supposed to be happening, and I'll explain that briefly in a minute. But these are, as you can see, held on a rack of 4. These things here are winglets that pop out. This is hanging on here upside down to its flight orientation, so it falls off, opens the wings, flips over, and then flies, through the window of the bad guy's technical. It's a pretty gnarly piece of weaponry that I think we're going to see more and more of, given the type of conflicts that we get involved with. Anyway, so that's that. But I was going to say, I forgot to say that when I designed these GBU 54s, I designed them in 3 pieces to make painting easier because of that hard color separation between the tail unit, the bomb casing, and the nose piece. In retrospect, I think I might have attempted to actually make the shackle on the front as a separate piece, but it's just sheet metal, and so as a 3D printed part, it would be super thin. I've seen people do it in 1/32, and it's pretty dope, but I just wasn't really ready to go there at 1/48. Anyway, I think it all turned out pretty well. I think I might need to, if I were going to do these again, or if I was going to reprint and reuse them again, that I might go back and make these the relief height on these details a little bit greater. This is one of those things that when you're designing your own parts that you have to make decisions about. Because when you're doing the CAD work, and if you do what looks realistic, there's a good chance it's not going to print well if it's something like sheet metal. Like, for example, these band clamps that go around the bombs, those are just really thin sheet metal. And so they're, at scale, they're just going to be really, really thin. And so your goal has to be to make it stick out from the surface enough that it's going to show as a detail and hold a wash and not be impossible to paint. And so sometimes that means that when you're doing the design work, you have to make it look a little ridiculous in the CAD model to get the end result that you want, and learning exactly how much is kind of a matter of personal style and experience. So I'm kind of getting there. But anyway, what I did not include in the CAD file was the texture on those bombs. The Navy uses a thermal protective barrier to help keep these things from cooking off in the magazine, and it's like a nubbly foam spray, and I created that using Mr. Surfacer 500 thinned a lot with Tamiya Extra Thin. I also used some thick goopy lacquer primer, stuff that I often use for spot filling. This old All-Clad 309, it's great. This bottle right here is worth its weight in gold to me. But it works pretty good to stipple on because it gets tacky real quickly. And then you can use lacquer thinner and something like a Deerfoot stippler to work that texture in. So you could use it on armor for a cast texture. Works pretty good. But anyway, the foam is typically a light gray or a yellowish gray color. And that's why I did this. And yeah, it's a little bit, it's a little bit dramatic, but that's what I wanted. You'll see reference photos of bombs that look like this. Maybe not, again, quite as Technicolor, but the bomb casings will still rust underneath, and that rust will leach out through that foam spray, I think is what happens. And so you get these really cool patterns of orange and tan and gray, and I think it's beautiful, and I really wanted to emphasize that. So that's the story on the bombs. The tanks, also one of my favorite things. You see these in all conditions in reference photos. I believe that they are a carbon Kevlar weave on these modern tanks. And so you'll see that showing through in some places. Some places it's just the grease and the grime. You see them painted different shades of gray. I just, again, the variety of those things is just really cool. And I wanted to incorporate that as much as possible. But that and all the rest of this weathering is all oil paint rendering. And if you're wondering about the orange rust tones back here, that is apparently, I believe that is dye that is put in hydraulic fluid so that you can see when it's leaking. And this is a pretty common thing on the tail on the underside of the tail of Hornets. I've had some of these guys who work on them tell me that these deposits after time will just get gunky like porridge. So that's what's going on there. But what also happens is that these guys have to get into these little access hatches like you see right here. And so what they will do is they'll get a rag that's got degreaser on it, solvent, aviation gas, I don't know what they use, but they'll wipe away all the gunk and it leaves this sort of telltale ring around it, and the hatch itself then is more of its natural color. And so it looks kind of like a tide mark, but that's not what's going on there. I actually did the whole thing and then came back with a Q-tip and a brush and worked on that with mineral spirits to create that ring, to give it that appearance of having been wiped away. And I think it's pretty cool. I think it adds a lot of authenticity, and because of oils being basically a sort of oily substance, they tend to behave naturally in much the same way that the real stuff, the real gunk, does. So there's that. All right, now I'm gonna flip this thing back over right side up, and we'll talk about the rest of it from there. Okay, so again, looking at the top of it, more oil paint rendering to capture these shaped stains, and the foot traffic prints and all that all over the top of it is, same as I've always done. But one thing that I didn't talk about yet is the speckled paint. So what's going on there is just corrosion control, where basically these guys are, walking out there and inspecting the aircraft, and any place that they find where paint is looking thin or it's gotten scratched or whatever, they can't have that with the salt air on the carrier, and so they'll just take a can of spray paint and shoot some over the top of it. And my understanding is that where you'll sometimes see these multi-layer spots, it's as almost like a low-key record-keeping kind of thing, so that you can see how many times it's been done. And because it's always a different color. And I've got reference photos that show all different shades of gray. I've even got one that shows a bunch of patches like this on an F-18 in green. And I was, you can believe, I was really tempted to do that. But, self-restraint and all that. Anyway, so let's talk about the and I did all of that freehand with my little Frankenbrush airbrush that I love, that I just need hardly any excuse to use. I've got a video about this thing. I built this out of parts a couple of years ago. It's this GSI PS275. It's got an Iwata HPB 0.2 millimeter needle in it, and the nozzle and the air cap are from a PS267. This thing is fantastic. I love the control that I get with it. Just to give you kind of a specific example, one thing that I wanted to do was try and create the look of where the dude just grabs his spray can and sprays just like a little spot, a little round spot of paint. And so you'll see some of those in different places on the fuselage. Like there's one right there. And spraying a little spot like that is harder than you'd think. I mean, it's a prime opportunity to get spidering. And that airbrush really just made all of this possible even. I couldn't have done it with any other tool that I own. So stoked about that. Anyway, so let's talk about markings real quick. So the decals for this thing that came off of the kit decal sheet and the afterburner decal sheet, as I talked about before, are really, really good. But they weren't going to work for me everywhere because I chose to depict this thing as an aircraft that might exist in the future. This is a could-be project. And the reason that I did that is because I wanted to make it just roached. But all of the markings on the decal sheets that come with the kit and the afterburner decals are all circa early 2000s, like 2005, 2008 type thing. And when I studied reference photos of the VFA 27, the Royal Mesas, I could see very clearly they've got a really great website where you can see the chronological demise of the paint on their Hornets. And they just aren't as beat up 15 years ago. And I wanted this thing to be really beat up. I wanted the story to make sense. And so I thought, well, I'm going to have to make my own markings. Yeah, because even though the afterburner decal sheet is VFA 27, they don't have anything that reflects a current aircraft. It's the usual, CAG bird type thing. So I'm like, well, if I'm going to have to make my own markings, fuck it. I'm just going to go, full on, whatever I want to do. And so I picked an aircraft number that I know is, at least as of 2 years ago, was in the Royal Mesas, and it could still be 10 years from now. But what they're probably not going to still be 10 years from now is on board the Ronald Reagan, which is where they were 2 or 3 years ago when the latest reference photos I have were taken. So then I thought, well, what carrier could I put them on? And so then I was like, well, how about one that's not built yet? How about the Doris Miller? And so that's what you see going on here. You can zoom in there. You can see USS Doris Miller. I chose the Doris Miller because not only is it not built yet, in fact, the keel is going to be laid down, I think, in 2026. But the story of Doris Miller is just really cool. If you've seen the second version of Pearl Harbor, the one with Ben Affleck and all that, even if you hate it, remember the part where Cuba Gooding runs out on the deck of the USS Arizona and fights the Japanese with the machine gun on the deck. He's a cook. That was Doris Miller, and he was awarded the Navy Cross for that. He was the first Black American to be awarded the Navy Cross. I originally thought it was the Medal of Honor, and I swear that's what I read, but it was in fact the Navy Cross. Probably should have been the Medal of Honor, but unfortunately, he did not survive World War II. He ended up being killed in action at a later time. But a true hero, and I thought the story was cool, and so that's why I chose the Doris Miller. Now, how to get those markings on there? Well, the sort of natural option was to do it's too small to paint. The aircraft number, no problem. Those are all masked and painted. But those letters and the aircraft and then the serial number, yeah, too small. The Navy right there, plenty big enough to mask and spray. But those little bitty letters, way too small, as well as the lettering over here on the on this gear door, where we've got this Joe Bishop 2032 All-Stars. Can I put that on there? It's a little bit of an inside joke with the Joe Bishop thing. If you know, you know. But 2032 dates this where I want it to be in the future. Anyway, you can probably tell that the resolution there is not that great and that those letters are not super crisp. That's because what I did is I used dry transfers. If you're not familiar with those, I talked about them quite a bit in some of my random videos. I showed where they came from. But basically, those are the old school things where you hold the dry transfer sheet down and burnish it and the letters stay stuck to the surface. It worked okay, and you'd think it's pretty compelling because you get no decal film. But as you can see, the resolution is not just super, super sharp. and it's not durable at all. If you don't put a clear coat over it immediately, they'll rub right off. So I don't know, that was a little bit of an experiment, and I don't know that I would do that again, but that's how we learn. I was also going to do it here for the pilot's name, but because of the resolution not being great, I elected to go back to what I knew, which was printing my own decals. But that's a lot of clear film, and I didn't want to take the chance of having a bunch of clear film showing, because that's just a non-starter. So I did a halftone gray, because this is not something that you will see a lot, but it's also not uncommon for somebody to mask off an area like that and spray it before spraying new lettering on there with a stencil. Or it could even be a vinyl sticker. I've seen those in reference photos as well. But point being is that with that halftone gray on covering the entire film, there's no way you're going to look at that and go, oh, clear film showing. So, it was a bit of a compromise, but I think it was the right decision, because those letters right there where they're super visible need to be as crisp as any decal would ever be. So I'm pretty happy with the way all that came out. The markings here on this door, that was kind of a trick. I talked about that in one of my random videos. But that decal that's up above that hexagonal thing, that is chopped up from 2 decals on the Afterburner sheet into about 7 pieces and stitched back together to represent that more modern version of that. It's like a warning label reference kind of thingamajig. I don't know why it wasn't on the Afterburner sheet, but it turned out okay. So there's that. Now, the other markings that I have to talk about, because all the other markings were sprayed, including the VFA 27. Oh wait, I take that back. The tail markings for the Royal Mesas, which are really, really nice. Those are decals from Afterburner, and they really are just lovely. I screwed that one up by partially peeling it off with a piece of stray masking tape, but luckily Afterburner gives you an extra one, which was really nice of them, and I was able to kind of do that whole, repainted and remasked kind of look like I've got going on everywhere else. But all the other tail markings there, the lettering, the number, all that is masked and painted. The Slime Light decals came out of off the Ming sheet, and they're fine, no issues with them. All right, so sorry, let me get reoriented here. Anyway, so the one thing though where I am not super happy with sprayed on markings is the stars and bars. I went through the whole process of creating the masks and doing all that, and honestly, I don't know that juice was worth the squeeze. I don't know that I would do that again for stars and bars of this type at 1/48, because the decals are really good, and the mask, the bars obviously they're just too skinny, and that happened partly because I had the correct geometry to trace over, and I held to it. I think I did an okay job of tracing it, but the masks just came out skinny. I don't know if it was because the vinyl moved around, or if the knife blade was a little thick, or I don't know, but it just came out a little bit wrong, and I'm not super happy with it, and I just don't know that I would do that again. I don't know. I say that, but watch. If I ever do another modern jet with that type of markings, I'm just going to go and modify them, because spraying them really is the best way. It's just that the masks for those really kind of proved to be problematic, and I just, I could have done better. Anyway, I think that's really it. Oh, wait, there is one more thing I guess I should talk about. So I also wanted to do another cool marking thing that you see on these jets, and that also would help date it. And that's right there on the side of the gun access door where it says 300 HEI 26 Nov 32. I did that with a white pencil. And this is worth noting if you ever want to do this, because I had some difficulty with it because of the pencil itself. So let me just give you the same info so that if you ever want to do this, you too will have nice crisp markings. Because these watercolor pencils, even though they say watercolor pencil, they're not all created the same. So this is the one I started out with, this Prismacolor, which a lot of us have. And they work pretty good, but this is a kind of this pencil is kind of waxy and soft. And it made it very difficult, no matter what I did, whether I wet the surface first, wet the pencil first, no matter how sharp I got it, it was very difficult to hold a really fine line because it was just too soft and it would get dull and crumble. So I asked an artist friend and she was like, well, why don't you try this other one, this Polychromos? So I got one of these, and this is in fact much better. It has a much harder lead. It's not as hard as like a 2H pencil, but it's a lot harder than the Prismacolor. And so you can keep a sharp point on it, and as long as you've got a totally matte surface, you can draw pretty effectively with this, and you can make a nice facsimile of a chalk mark even at 1/48 scale. It's a little bit thick, but I've seen pictures of these aircraft mechanics, armorers, whatever, making these markings with really small chalk and really large chalk. So, as long as you're in the right neighborhood, it's pretty good. You can see there that, it's bright enough to work and look like chalk, and still thin enough to not, look out of scale. So anyway, that's that. I think that's everything. I'm sure you guys are happy for me to stop talking about the little Hornet here, and I certainly am glad to be done talking about it. It's been a long, difficult project. I'm overall really happy with it. I totally fell in love with Super Hornets because they're so unique. They're like animals. Every one of them has its own unique sort of patterns and coloring, and I think you could just build nothing but Hornets and never run out of cool shit to do. I, however, am not going to be doing that, at least not until maybe we see a Hornet kit from Tamiya or somebody. So anyway, that's that. That's all she wrote. Okay, so there you go. Not a lot more to say about this thing. It's been pretty exhaustively covered by myself, by other people. It's been really interesting because I've compared notes along the way with several other builders. Jason over at Primed Model Works is actually doing one right now, and he's been going through some stuff. Darren with the Model Geeks built one. He did a great job. I know that Jason's will be really nice. Gabe Pincelli, a guy that maybe not a lot of you have heard of, he's a master craftsman. He's building one. I've been comparing notes with these guys, and we really are all finding mostly the same issues. What you can clearly see is that there's a break between, there's probably not a nice way to say this, so I'm just going to say it. The guys that really turn out really good work, like Jason and Darren and Gabe, really see a lot of the issues with this kit. Guys that are just less concerned with producing top-notch work, not as wrapped up in the problems or the challenges, whatever you want to call them, and you can see that in the finished product. There's plenty of guys out there who are like, oh yeah, I didn't have a problem with this kit, and then when you look at their work, you can see where all of the flaws or challenges or problems that I and others have made note of actually are right there. They just either didn't notice or didn't care, and that's totally fine. I mean, we all have to decide what our sort of tolerance for that stuff is, and what standards we want to try and build to based on our energy and time and frankly vision. I mean, a lot of guys just don't see stuff. Everybody has a sort of different level of resolution when it comes to details. So at any rate, I think this is a kit that's definitely worth buying, definitely worth building, but it also has to come with the "your mileage may vary" warning on the box. So at any rate, if you've suffered through all of my, whining and moaning and going on about it, and then, thank you. As always, I appreciate that. Hopefully it's been of value to you as you do your own. And maybe, I don't know, maybe if the guys at Ming are watching this, it will help them, because I really do think that they produce a lot of cool stuff, and I expect to see more cool stuff from them in the future. So maybe this will, in some way be of value to them. This is how engineering works. This is the feedback loop. So at any rate, I'll shut my mouth and just as always say thank you for watching and much love.